Hi, I'm John Davidson, Director of Epidemic of Fraud. To keep up with the latest news about our movie, go to epidemicoffraud.com, and to support our work, you can make a donation, and you can participate in a write-in campaign to convince network executives at ABC, NBC, CBS, and Discovery, the owner of CNN, to make more movies, documentaries, and films like this that tell the stories that they omitted and censored for the last 4 to 5 years. Many people have been harmed by medical malpractice, hospital homicide protocols, vaccine injuries, and so much more. Their stories need to be told. We could resurrect Hollywood with good stories of real Americans. I hope you'll participate today. I threw my career away and put my company in jeopardy, so if you'd like to help us, hire my company, Magic Feather Inc., to promote your product, your service, or your campaign. Find out more at magicfeatherinc.com. Now grab some popcorn and enjoy the show. My name is John, and I am a storyteller. And this is kind of my story. My life has been blessed. I have a beautiful, loving family. I've spent years as a director, producer, visual effects supervisor, and writer. And for a very long time, I was part of the media. You would have seen my work on Big Bang Theory. I did marketing, I did co-producing for films, I directed. My life was awesome. And then 2020 happened. I began to prepare for COVID in January of 2020 so that when it hit, my company was ready to continue to make products for networks. But I didn't just stop there. I made public service announcements. I made some of the earliest videos telling you to stay home. I made public service announcements telling you to wear masks. I even promoted vaccines. I was once a CNN editor. When healthcare workers were being censored, I had to investigate. I've interviewed doctors, nurses, vaccine-injured, malpractice survivors, and even interacted with heads of the FDA. And my work has been repeatedly censored. What I've found is an unholy alliance of public, private, and political groups that seem hell-bent on turning all of us into lab rats. Our journey starts with a class of medications that for hundreds of years has decided the fate of nations. And it just may do it again.
Americans ultimately always do the right thing, but only after they've tried everything else.
Now there's an optimist.
And right now we're trying everything else.
Hydroxychloroquine. Leave this in. We knew these medications were safe. We treated these patients for that 5-day regimen. We gave them 400 milligrams of hydroxychloroquine twice a day on day 1. On days 2 through 5, we gave them 200 milligrams twice a day.
You see it on TV.
Chloroquine. Hydroxychloroquine.
I use zinc, hydroxychloroquine, and azithromycin within the first 5 days of the onset of symptoms.
You read about it on social media. Doctors from coast to coast are in a war with our medical establishment and research institutions.
It's obvious that this drug works and would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives.
Like some doctors are saying, we use hydroxychloroquine and Z-Paks, and I've had amazing success treating patients. Banned, video banned, and the dangerous information. My own doctor said hydroxychloroquine is fantastic if you catch it early.
Very, very safe drug, can be taken by pregnant women and nursing mothers. It's got over 50 years of safety record. Cardiac events were never, ever a major concern with this drug.
It keeps people out of the hospital.
I can't think of a single viral infection where the best advice is to wait 2 weeks before we start treatment in the hospital. That's the current NIH recommendations. Americans are appalled by this.
But if you ask your doctors what's going on, they don't want to talk about it.
When patients would bring a prescription for hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin to a trained drugstore, the pharmacists were denying the treatment, which to me is outrageous.
Many of the developed countries around the world that are actually prohibiting doctors and sanctioning them if it is prescribed to their patients. And such a violation, I have to stress, has never occurred before for any medication ever.
What if you found out that most of the doctors have not done the research they quote or even read the studies?
This is medicine, and medicine should be based on data and science.
What if you found out that the public doctors we trust were ignoring, and in some cases hiding, studies that hold the key to saving your life, the lives of the ones you love, and the fate of an entire nation?
This is about science and data. There are randomized trials that show that it doesn't work. There are observational trials that show that it might work.
There are some studies that suggest that it might work. There are other studies that show that it doesn't work at all.
Changes to basic science methodology, threats from hospitals, and influence in every level of our medical establishment and government have rendered your doctors mute, blind, or worse, complicit.
Do they charge you've been misleading the American public? I have not been misleading the American public under any circumstances.
We're not treating the COVID, guys. For real, we're not treating the COVID. Nobody is listening.
America outspends almost every other nation per person on medical care. Yet we had the greatest number of COVID deaths. Compared to other countries, our COVID response was abysmal. What did these countries know, and how can we prevent this from happening again? To understand this, we have to understand our history and the history of hydroxychloroquine. What is hydroxychloroquine? Hydroxychloroquine is a derivative of chloroquine, one of the first malarial drugs invented. Chloroquine was based off of a drug called quinine. Quinine is also credited as the first chemical compound used to treat an infectious disease. Quinine was initially ground from the bark of a cinchona tree. It was given to settlers from Spain by Indians near Peru in the 1600s and brought to the Western world as a cure for malaria. Eventually, Jesuit priests traveled the world with cinchona bark, so much so that it was commonly known as Jesuit's bark. In 1751, the Spanish crown took control of all the sources of quinine, restricting access as a new form of scientific-based imperialism. At the beginning of the American Revolution, George Washington requested his political masters buy up as much cinchona bark and quinine powder as possible, a deciding factor in the fate of the new nation, because in 1778, the Spanish crown restricted British access to quinine. In 1820, quinine was officially isolated, reducing the need for cinchona tree bark. That development opened the door of European exploration to all of Africa, considered at the time the white man's graveyard, due to how many Europeans died from malaria on the continent. In the 1860s, during the American Civil War, southern states relied heavily on shipping for goods, services, and medications. So Honest Abe Lincoln and his advisors enacted the Northern Blockade to block cotton shipments to Europe, weapons imports, and quinine. Lincoln's goal with blocking quinine was to create as many sick and dead Southern soldiers as possible, because a sick soldier slows down an army and drains resources. This ultimately means that Abraham Lincoln could be considered by some a practitioner of biological warfare against men and women, young and old, free and slave. Things were so desperate for the South that John Wilkes Booth, Lincoln's alleged assassin, smuggled quinine to friends and family. In their desperation, Southern doctors searched for native plants and trees local to the South to replace cinchona. The one that came up the most? The bark of a dogwood tree. When the information was provided to doctors across the South that they had a potential alternative, the doctors didn't use it because they felt it hadn't had enough clinical trials and didn't want to be considered homeopaths. Where have we heard that before?
The information that you're referring to specifically is anecdotal. It was not done in a controlled clinical trial, so you really can't make any definitive statement about it.
The role of quinine in war doesn't stop there. In the 1860s, malaria was a major issue for English soldiers in India, so soldiers began combining the bitter-tasting quinine with water and an alcoholic beverage to get their daily dose of the life-saving medicine. Thus, the gin and tonic was born. The medicinal beverage was so important to the crown that Winston Churchill stated,
"The gin and tonic drink has saved more Englishmen lives and minds than all the doctors in the empire."
With Africa opened up to exploration, European countries vied for colonies and power in Africa, creating rivalries that influenced World War I. By the 1930s, the primary locations for growing cinchona moved from South America to India and Indonesia, lands that would soon be cut off to the Allies. In World War II, the United States was desperate for a source of quinine in Cinchona and returned to South America in a series of Cinchona missions to build a supply chain and protect Allied troops. At the same time, Nazi scientists weaponized mosquitoes with malaria. The Nazis then conducted experiments on prisoners with these mosquitoes at Dachau concentration camp. Many of these prisoners were Jesuit priests. As World War II drew to a close, when United States and the United Kingdom troops advanced on Rome, the German troops cut window screens of all the homes in the region, confiscated quinine from the residents, and allegedly released their weaponized malaria-loaded mosquitoes. The advancing Allied troops were ready and protected with quinine, cinchona, and chloroquine, but the local population of Italians weren't so lucky. That year, there was a massive spike in civilian casualties from malaria, a parting gift from the fleeing Nazis. Hydroxychloroquine and drugs like it continued to be important over the years. For decades, American troops overseas have taken chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, and other derivatives of those drugs. One of those derivatives, mefloquine, has been implicated in causing post-traumatic stress disorder and neurological issues with troops that were stationed in Iraq. The issues surrounding mefloquine are so great that the drug received a black box warning, the FDA's most stringent warning possible. For centuries now, the restriction of access to hydroxychloroquine, quinine, and drugs like them has been a standard tactic of warfare. It was involved in the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, countless smaller wars all across the planet, and most importantly, what one day may be remembered as World War III. We've spoken with numerous pharmacists, doctors, and academics, and very few of them knew the history of hydroxychloroquine and quinine. It makes you wonder, who's really in control of our scientific institutions? And what are we teaching our medical doctors? Our government officials, our educated academics, tried to convince us that tonic water was deadly, and most of you believed it. Throughout this film, you're going to see videos and clips taken from whistleblowers who tried to warn us about issues with our medical establishments. You will see how coordinated this medical establishment was at using certain catchphrases like anecdotal evidence, conspiracy theory, or randomized clinical trials. You'll also hear journalists use questionable terms like tout, debunk, or peddle. In marketing, we use focus groups to find out which words elicit emotional or negative connotations when used. When you hear these kinds of words, understand, you're not listening to news or science. You're listening to propaganda. Rahm Emanuel once stated, "You never want a serious crisis to go to waste." With trillions of dollars ready to be spent to combat COVID, watch how all of our medical leaders bent over backwards to discredit one of the safest, cheapest, and most beneficial medications in human history. And they did it by manipulating science and data.
Many Americans have read studies and heard media reports about this drug chloroquine, which is an anti-malarial drug. It's already approved, as the president said, for the treatment of malaria as well as an arthritis condition. That's a drug that the president has directed us to take a closer look at as to whether an expanded use approach to that could be done to actually see if that benefits patients. And again, we want to do that in the setting of a clinical trial, a large pragmatic clinical trial, to actually gather that information and answer the question that needs to be answered and asked and answered.
The Chinese study from Wuhan reflected statistically significant improvement in recovery from fever, from cough, and in pneumonia as well.
That was not a very robust study. It is still possible that there is a beneficial effect, but the study that was just quoted, on a scale of strength of evidence, that's not overwhelmingly strong. It's an indication, a hint of it.
A study released yesterday on hydroxychloroquine is shockingly irresponsible. Even the Secretary of Veteran Affairs had to admit the weakness of this study.
That's an observational study. It's not a clinical study. It was done on a small number of veterans. Sadly, those of whom were in the last stages of life.
Basically, patients who are a few steps from the morgue.
Looking for a book to buy Grandma this dark winter? Check out How to Lie with Statistics by Daryl Huff. It's recommended by Bill Gates and teaches you everything you need to know to commit genocide the sciencey way. Available at brokentruth.com.
In May 11th of 2020, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a study by Rosenberg et al. That claimed hydroxychloroquine was examined and found to not have any difference in outcome versus patients who didn't receive it. It looks like a study designed to fail. What I then did was I analyzed their data with colleagues at prominent universities. When you took the groups out that did have no benefit from an early stage treatment and just said, well, let's look at the people who received the drug approximately in the time frame they should have received it. The study showed it worked. 85 to 90% was what I found versus a survival rate without the drug of under 53%. So there's a huge difference. Suddenly that confirmed studies out of Spain, Belgium, Switzerland, the Henry Ford study. Pretty much every study that had been done showing hydroxychloroquine worked showed the same statistics. There was a very strong evidence that hydroxychloroquine was saving a lot of lives back in those early days in New York. This study prevented people from taking up the drug. My article was published in World Tribune. Just as the article was getting attention, boom, Twitter banned me and deleted the article. And that was it. I was off Twitter. This is something that could have ended the pandemic if people had understood it. And instead, it's being suppressed. The authors of the study were Eli Rosenberg, and then the highest ranking author was Howard Zucker. Howard Zucker was the health commissioner in the state of New York.
Howard Zucker's role in the COVID pandemic in New York was notorious because he was directly involved in the policy of returning sick COVID patients to nursing homes, where they could infect others. Howard Zucker also played a key role in hiding the actual death toll from nursing home patients who died from COVID in New York.
So stay informed and don't be misled by rumors and false information.
Zucker was also involved in New York State's disastrous COVID-19 vaccine mandates. Zucker later resigned, but not before his health department hired Eli Rosenberg, his old co-author, to work for New York State. It wasn't all bad for Howard. The Biden administration made him a top dog at the CDC. But trust them, it's totally not political. During the Cold War, the CIA created something called Operation Mockingbird. This is where the CIA colluded and worked with journalists across all media to influence public perception. Are the journalists and scientists that you're about to see part of a modern-day version of Operation Mockingbird? You be the judge.
Breaking news this morning, a new study shows, and this is an expansive study, that the anti-malaria drug that the president touted repeatedly.
This is a very, very large study.
The largest study to date of its kind.
It's a very large study.
The size of this study.
It was a massive study.
This is a very, very large study.
Much larger.
Much larger than previous studies.
It's a huge development. Huge.
Large study published by The Lancet.
In The Lancet, which is a very influential medical journal.
Published in The Lancet. It's one of our clearest studies.
This is a really powerful study.
It's large but shows real danger here.
Increased risk of death. Increased risk of dying.
So this is a dangerous drug.
It was dangerous. That hydroxychloroquine does more bad than good.
It hurts.
We're more likely to die. This is no cure.
There is harm. Probably dangerous.
Let's bring in Dr. Supan Desai. He is one of the lead researchers of the study.
And I think before we start making claims on medications that work or don't work, let science do its job. Let data drive this discussion. This study involves 671 hospitals.
671 hospitals.
600 hospitals over 6 continents. Nearly 700 hospitals.
Tens of thousands of people.
96,000 seriously ill COVID-19 patients.
96,000 patients.
Almost 100,000 patients. It is high-quality evidence.
The off-label use of these medications in hospitalized patients with COVID should immediately stop.
Is there any data that suggests that taking it before you're sick will keep you from getting sick?
Not yet.
Seems to debunk a lot of the miracle cure claim that's been peddled by President Trump.
The president has been reckless in his promotion of this drug.
The president has promoted the drug, touted by and taken by President Trump.
Nancy Pelosi was bringing up that if you have a pre-existing condition, and she was saying that the president fell into that range with his heart and his weight.
This is in line with this Trump doctrine. But the president does not know what he's talking about when it comes to science.
He is definitely not a doctor.
He should probably acknowledge that he was wrong.
Why not take it? Because you might die.
How many people listened to him and how many people
took it.
He also claimed political bias.
He's been taking it.
Why is he taking it?
The president ought to stop taking it too.
Well, he stopped taking it yesterday.
A risk to prescribe this to the sitting president?
Absolutely.
Chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine both are associated with a higher risk of dangerous heart arrhythmias and an increased chance of death.
Science and facts be damned.
Breaking news that we are following today, the World Health Organization has temporarily halted studying the Trump-touted drug hydroxychloroquine as a potential treatment for coronavirus, citing safety concerns. Officials made the decision after new findings linked it to a higher risk of death.
The WHO had to act, but they have to pause this one now, that it's not ethical to continue.
Unethical to continue. I think that really encapsulates what is going on here.
A paper published in The Lancet in May of 2020 that said hydroxychloroquine didn't work for COVID was retracted after the authors were unable to confirm that any of the data was accurate.
An influential article which found the drug hydroxychloroquine increased the risk of death in COVID-19 patients was retracted on Thursday.
It was all fake.
And its implications led several other COVID-19 studies to be halted.
This study had, of course, triggered the suspension of HCQ clinical trials around the world.
Said the WHO suspended the trials because of this study that was published in The Lancet.
Used alone or with a macrolide, they estimated a higher mortality rate.
The Lancet and New Control Medicine were party to, as was Dr. Fauci was, they spiked the use of hydroxychloroquine.
Dr. Fauci himself basically declared the drug a lost cause, and yet a deafening silence from Dr. Fauci today.
This is academic malfeasance, published by individuals interested in doing evil to the world with respect to a beneficial treatment of hydroxychloroquine. They were scare papers to scare people on hydroxychloroquine. Since that time, there's been dozens of pile-on scare tactics in academics. This isn't the government. This is people in my field, in academic medicine, who are committing academic fraud. I'm a cardiologist. I reviewed a paper demonstrating that hydroxychloroquine causes a heart attack, that hydroxychloroquine causes a giant scar in the heart. I can tell you firsthand, hydroxychloroquine does not cause giant scars in the heart. So academic medicine is committing a fraud, is committing, I think, a crime against humanity. There must be a motivation behind this that's much bigger than just Democrat versus Republican.
So on May 11th, you've got the JAMA study, and then on May 22nd, you have the Lancet study. Now that was, of course, retracted because it was completely fraudulent. But how did the two studies work together in shaping a public imagination? Well, the JAMA study said drug doesn't do anything, and the Lancet study said this drug could actually increase your fatality risk. So I think these two studies actually really worked together, and I think their timing, I doubt that it was coincidental.
But this is medical fraud for political purpose.
Where are the mea culpas from Dr. Fauci, from all these medical journalists, from all of these media types who gleefully proclaimed this drug is dead?
Despite the retraction, the faked Surgisphere study has been repeatedly cited as evidence in other studies. Mandeep Mira and Frank Rushitska continue to speak publicly and write studies. Amit Patel and Sapan Desai almost vanished. But Sapan Desai has turned up in Massachusetts. While he's not currently practicing medicine, he is an expert witness for hire. This is the study that made me question everything. So I tracked down one of Sapan Desai's former employees, and on condition of anonymity, here's what this employee had to say, as dictated by this fake AI voice.
It's crazy because he and his wife both worked in hospitals. Indian folks, always on the up and up with everything. He was a minimalist. His suits were old, briefcase falling apart. Their bedrooms only consisted of an old bed, a dresser and a shower and toilet. He was so frugal. Lived minimally aside from his sports cars. He seemed more focused on performing his surgeries and seeing patients and developing the starter program, quartz clinical, than reaping the financial benefits. When I had last spoke to him, he said he was getting death threats and people knew where he lived, so they showed up at his house. From what I know, he had set up his own server in his house. I saw it, so he could run his own software. He was really smart. He built the entire website and healthcare analytics platform himself, and his wife worked in it for a long time. I had a phone call with him around the time this all happened. He acted like he had no idea what was going on, and that was the last time I ever heard from him.
The harm this fraud caused is unmeasurable, but if there's one thing you should take away from what you just heard, it's that somewhere out there is an email server that could tell us who Sapan Desai was in contact with, who may have encouraged him to fake his data and promote remdesivir.
We've identified several antiviral medications that seem to have a positive impact. There was an article published yesterday talking about remdesivir shortening the length of stay in the hospital.
Sapan Desai has not been prosecuted. His medical licenses are expired. His board certification was revoked. CNN under President Jeff Zucker gave 105 seconds to the retraction.
The Recovery Trial Study Protocol Note is funded in part by the Wellcome Trust and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
We really don't know if we're giving the best care, and we need to get the evidence so that we can move forward with confidence.
Why wouldn't we use this for something that's killing people?
The dosages that you'll be using for coronavirus are far greater than the dosages that you use for malaria or that you use for autoimmune diseases such as lupus.
The doses being used in both Solidarity, the WHO trials, and the Recovery UK trials, two independent studies, they were both using levels that were about 4 times the maximum dose for any medical condition. There are no medical conditions at which these doses would be prescribed. In fact, when Landry was kind of confronted with these issues, he apparently was making some kind of careless mistake, believing and maybe even misinterpreting hydroxyquinolone for hydroxychloroquine.
Let me explain. The doses were chosen on the basis of pharmacokinetic modelling. These are in line with the sort of doses that are used for amoebic dysentery.
Do you know what's the lethal level of hydroxychloroquine?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's something like 10 times that.
The World Health Organization set these levels.
The quantities that were being given in the Manaus, Brazil study and in the recovery trial were excessive. And when you have a severely ill patient, late phase patient with existing comorbidities, it's the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back.
The trial was amended so that patients who were unconscious and had no family available could be placed without their consent by their physician into the trial. And later, the trial was amended to add children. This was an open-label study. All of the hospitals, doctors, and nurses who participated all over the world knew what they were doing. This is a golden standard.
This is a study designed by the World Health Organization that is not only designed to fail, it's designed to kill.
Prophylaxis is any action taken to prevent disease or a biological event. Condoms are prophylaxis against pregnancy. Our medical industry knows very well how prophylaxis works, which is why their reaction to using hydroxychloroquine as a prophylaxis was so concerning. Members of the political left also know how prophylaxis works. Just ask Scott Wiener, the former senator from California. He participated in a campaign for Truvada, an HIV prophylaxis created by Gilead. Many medical officials also campaigned for this drug, including Dr. Anthony Fauci. Later, Truvada was implicated in kidney failure among homosexual men who took it. Gilead was accused of creating 2 versions of their pill and releasing a more dangerous and toxic version for profit.
The core is that Gilead, for profit reasons, decided to shelve, in 2004, to shelve the safe drug, even though they knew it was safer, and wait until the patent life had expired on less safe drug and then launch it as new and improved.
Now you know how Gilead works and how prophylaxis works.
Dr. David Boulware is leading the trial, and he joins us now to tell us more about it. Doctor, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
So we basically launched a clinical trial that's looking at prevention of COVID-19 disease in high-risk people who have been exposed. In the next week to 10 days, we'll be fully enrolled, and we'll have a result back in about 3 to 3.5 weeks.
According to a July 2020 article from Marilyn Marchion, Dr. Boulware stated that he paid $5,000 of his own money to buy hydroxychloroquine to use in the trial. According to grant disclosures, the medications were donated by a company that 3 weeks later entered negotiations with Gilead to make generic forms of their more profitable remdesivir. When asked about the donations, Dr. Boulware avoided admitting that he was ever reimbursed for his purchases. But more curiously, Dr. Boulware was unaware that there was a brand name version of hydroxychloroquine named Plaquenil. How could a doctor conduct a study on a drug, yet not know the brand name of that same drug?
We conducted a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial to try to eliminate bias and get the best quality data that's possible. So what we found was that there was no effect of hydroxychloroquine.
So in the hydroxychloroquine group, it was 12%, and in the placebo group, it was 14%.
Dr. Boulware's interpretation of the study was disputed by Marcio Watanabe, a PhD statistician out of Brazil. Marcio discovered that the study in fact did show a statistical benefit of hydroxychloroquine. Another interesting result of the study was that despite higher than recommended doses, no serious side effects were seen. The New England Journal of Medicine has still not published this update.
There's a double blind, and so what that means is that neither the participants nor the investigators actually knew what they were receiving.
All of those randomized controlled trials were not blinded. The people knew which medications they were taking because it was stamped on the pills. To the Boulware studies and Skipper and all the others that Minnesota group put out, their outcomes of importance, hospitalization and mortality, are exceedingly small numbers, and therefore the randomization was worthless in those trials. They didn't adjust for anything in those trials to deal with the fact that they had weak randomization, and so this is all sham. Those studies are all sham. They have the look, the plausibility claim, oh, they're randomized trials, but what they are is sham evidence.
The day after he announced his hydroxychloroquine study, Dr. Boulware signed a deal with Revive Therapeutics, a pharmaceutical company developing busilamine, a different drug to treat COVID-19. In October of 2019, Dr. Boulware gave a speech where he disclosed a research grant from Gilead, maker of remdesivir. Once the damage was done and the drug was discredited, on July 6, 2020, Dr. Boulware submitted a new disclosure form to the American College of Physicians. As he states, Dr. Boulware has no relevant relationship with any company which makes therapeutics for post-exposure prophylaxis to coronavirus, unless you listen to former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb.
It's remdesivir, and it blocks viral replication. You want to get it in early before you have a lot of virus on board. You want to get it in early before you have a lot of virus on board.
Does that sound like prophylaxis? Dr. Boulware added new grant donors, acknowledged new relationships, including $17.79 worth of food and beverage funded by Gilead. While we admire his attention to detail, he neglected to disclose the $3.26 million donation from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to the University of Minnesota for COVID-19 research 2 weeks after his study began. As of February 2025, the 4 universities involved in the Boulware study have received over $412 million in Gates Foundation grants. In October of 2023, a new study of actual patients who were treated with hydroxychloroquine showed the drug was very beneficial in reducing mortality in COVID patients. Even with that evidence, Dr. Boulware refused to acknowledge the benefit of hydroxychloroquine, cleverly stating, hydroxychloroquine has not been shown to have any benefit in randomized clinical trials. If hydroxychloroquine was effective at preventing hospitalizations and deaths, the fear-based fountain of hundreds of billions of dollars for tests, genetic sequencing, vaccines, plasma, drugs, and research for COVID, all based on emergency use authorization, would end. Right after he gave the University of Minnesota millions of dollars, in April 2020, Bill Gates made his wishes abundantly clear to all the scientists and institutions that he funds.
Bill Gates, who describes his foundation's role in helping fund vaccine efforts in a blog post. Every additional month that it takes to get the vaccine is a month when the economy cannot return to normal. There is a lot of discussion among governments, the World Health Organization, the private sector, and our foundation about how to organize these efforts.
Unfortunately for the University of Minnesota, fraudulent and scandalous behavior is par for the course.
This was intentionally done, I believe, and others believe, to make room for vaccines and highly expensive in-hospital treatments, such as remdesivir. You can't stop a pandemic of a rapidly mutating RNA virus by vaccination or by in-hospital treatments. You have to do it on an outpatient basis. The patient comes in to see you. They fit the case definition. You have an extremely safe drug. You treat on suspicion. You don't wait for testing. You send the patient home to quarantine, and you treat their family at home. This is how you stop a pandemic of this nature.
I'm Dr. Sabine Hazen. I'm a gastroenterologist by trade. Have been doing clinical trials for pharmaceutical companies for almost 3 decades. I'm not here to shake the beehive of the FDA. I'm here to make sure that the FDA is doing what it's supposed to do, which is assuring my safety and the safety of millions of Americans that are paying taxes.
Right.
Because I spearhead the microbiome research, I started paying attention because of the genetic sequence of the virus. And we kind of joined forces with a lot of doctors in America. And when we collected stool samples, we noticed the whole sequence of COVID in the stools. We basically started analyzing what is the best combination therapy to put out. Some of the doctors were saying, vitamin C seems to be working in Italy. Then the protocol of Didier Raoult came out. Hydroxychloroquine was interesting because millions of prescriptions. We've never had any problems. Azithromycin was another good solution, and zinc certainly seemed plausible. I said, I bet you hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin kill the virus, and then vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc increase the microbiome, right? When we found the whole genome of COVID in the stools, we discovered that 2 people that were on hydroxychloroquine and Z-Pak didn't have the virus anymore. So I started writing the protocol sometime in March, and the FDA says, you don't need to do a clinical trial, proceed. And that was like April 3rd. A couple days later, they said, I'm sorry, Dr. Hazen, you have to do a full-on clinical trial. My protocol was seen by a lot of doctors on clinicaltrials.gov. April 13th, I get a letter from the Gates Foundation.
Here's the quote. We are helping WHO, the World Health Organization, to track and monitor clinical trials evaluating pre-exposure prophylaxis of healthcare workers. We are especially interested in those studies using either chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine.
Right. Wasn't that interesting?
The World Health Organization
yes,
was being coordinated with a private institution in the United States, and not just your clinical trial, but all of them.
Right. So I'm thinking, Mr. Gates wants to invest in my clinical trials, right? So I wrote a long letter saying, my family has been in the clinical trial business for years, and then I didn't hear back. April 19th, 2020. There was a tweet that went on Twitter. Nick DeVito, 5 therapies at once on 600 patients in a single-arm trial. What are we even doing? How does this get approved? And who is he? Clinical Research Integrity, University of Oxford. University of Oxford that started the clinical trial that Monday. At the same time, a retweet by Vinay Prasad, uncontrolled study of 5 drugs all at once for COVID, scientifically bankrupt, ethically bankrupt. COVID is pushing us to a new research lows. First of all, it's not 5 therapies. It's zinc, vitamin C, and vitamin D, and there's only 2 medications. So I'm seeing this and I'm like, you actually are thinking of doing a placebo-controlled trial in a pandemic where people are dying.
The Gates Foundation has given over $349 million to Nick DeVito's employer, the University of Oxford, and over $353 million to Vinay Prasad's employer, the University of California, San Francisco.
On Monday, there's a letter that went out from Stat News to all the regulatory agencies, including the FDA, that said, your thoughts on placebo in a pandemic. A new COVID-19 clinical trial is drawing up some attention on bio-Twitter. Aside from the controversy surrounding hydroxychloroquine and the gut-demolishing potential of a 24-week of an antibiotic, we did have a question for you. Do placebo arms even have a place in a fast-moving pandemic? So this was sent. That day, my protocol was put on hold. So they said, sorry, Dr. Hazen, you need to do a placebo-controlled trial.
Reports indicate this Stat News email was sent to the FDA and other regulatory officials, a select audience that would have the power to kill or delay Dr. Hazen's study.
I called the FDA and I said, okay, the placebo is going to be vitamins. New England IRB waits 2 weeks and says, I'm sorry, Dr. Hazen, we cannot take your protocol. Bottom line is I switched IRBs. It took us another month to get started. And if you'll recall, there was a lot of talking about hydroxychloroquine in the media. By the time we were ready to recruit, it was too late. The media had destroyed hydroxychloroquine. People that were dying were afraid to take it because they were afraid of a heart attack. And essentially, here I am with a protocol. It was very difficult to enroll. Doing clinical trial was never about the money for me. And it was more important for me to see the data first because I wanted to make sure, like, what is going on right now, right? Is this about money? Because if it's about money, then it's disgusting that we killed a person for the price of a stock. Interference in research happened.
The Gates Foundation allegedly invested $100 million in COVID therapeutics. But the organization has devoted far more to vaccine research, with over $6 billion going just to Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. Due to the legal requirements for emergency use authorizations, Gates' investments in vaccines would have been threatened by any drug proven to work against COVID. Luckily for the foundation, Dr. Hazen's trial was delayed until after the fraudulent Surgisphere study destroyed public confidence in hydroxychloroquine. Public records requests have recently revealed the Gates Foundation sought closed and confidential relationships with other HCQ clinical trials. Learn more at brokentruth.tv.
Bill Gates said, vaccine is the best investment I've ever made. I think we need to put the blame on whoever is controlling the FDA.
How has the last 4 years affected your perception of medicine?
It's really opened my eyes to the point that I say to myself, have I wasted 30 years of my life doing clinical trials for pharmaceutical companies?
Financial conflicts of interest in medicine.
In 2019, Dr. Jason Fung gave a presentation to medical students about conflicts of interest in medicine. His words were highly prophetic.
The universities are the most corrupted places in the world. These people are the people that are in the newspaper. They're the ones that are teaching medical students. They're the ones who are teaching the dietitians, the pharmacists, everybody. These highly, highly corrupted people who don't even know it.
The numbers are black and white. They don't lie.
We have questions that need answering before we can trust this data. Now, here's a question. How much of our science is done badly this way?
We depend on editors, the peer review.
Industry payments to editors. Look at the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. On average, each editor is getting $475,000 in that year. These are the people who are arguing to the FDA that drugs should or should not be approved for certain indications. How is it that the New England Journal of Medicine, our top journal, actually allows that? It's so biased. This is why the insiders say evidence-based medicine is largely useless or harmful. Selective publications, you have rigged outcomes, advertorials, people who work for the company who write an editorial for the New England Journal of Medicine. Journal editors are on the take, there's publication bias, and then financial conflicts of interest like everywhere.
Beginning of this year, the New England Journal published an absolutely horrific article where they concluded that only clinical trial data has any validity and anecdotal data or empirical real-world evidence is not to be used to set medical standard of care.
Clinical trials is a big part of the content of the New England Journal. Jeff Drazen, when he became the editor, said that he wanted to move the journal toward publishing more basic science and more clinical trials. He thought there was too heavy an emphasis on epidemiology, observational research.
I trust the New England Journal of Medicine. That's my journal. It's like, it's corrupt. That's what the insiders have said. The whole thing is a pile of crap.
A journal that has to pay its editors and its editorial staff and so on, that can't make all of its money on article submission fees, has to raise money and does it by advertising and becomes addicted to the advertising. And once that happens, which happens fairly quickly, the publisher of the journal has to kowtow to the interests of pharma, and those interests are very clearly expressed and feed down into the editors themselves. And Borton at Lancet and Marcia Angel at New England Journal all talked about this in their books and comments about the effects of pharma on medical publishing.
The randomized placebo-controlled trial is in fact the gold standard.
We have a whole vast medical literature that was not the standard. So why is it suddenly the standard now? All of the evidence needs to go into this discussion, not just a shibboleth of randomized controlled trials.
The drug companies oftentimes do the clinical trial that doesn't answer the clinical question. The physician will want to know, is your drug better than the drug I'm using now? But in order to get FDA approval, the company will do a placebo-controlled trial, assuming that it's ethical to do that. And so they don't answer the question the doctor really wants them to answer.
Questions like, despite a $5.9 billion budget, why isn't Dr. Fauci able to provide us with a study that shows whether or not hydroxychloroquine works early in tandem with zinc and Z-Pak?
Practicing physicians are going to rely on review articles in the New England Journal of Medicine, not realizing that they're actually written by the company.
Clinical trials system is maybe broken is too strong a term, but it's definitely underperforming.
All the negative papers that have appeared showing hydroxychloroquine doesn't work demonstrate profound ignorance in the pathology of COVID-19 as a disease.
Relying on a so-called theoretical randomized controlled trial is a red herring, because that is not the way the FDA works. It is not the way scientists work. It is not the way anybody works in real world.
Well, of course, hydroxychloroquine, as we've said before, is very cheap. Big Pharma does not make its money on cheap generics, but they do give a lot of money to NIH, CDC, and the WHO.
The Food and Drug Administration is ending its emergency authorization for the use of hydrochloroquine to treat COVID-19, saying that the malaria drug carries too many risks without any apparent benefit.
There's been a number of studies now that have come out that haven't shown a benefit. Some have shown a harm, as well as the information that it now could potentially interfere with the activity of remdesivir, a directly acting antiviral that we know does work against coronavirus.
This accidental admission that hydroxychloroquine interferes with a patient's ability to get sick enough to need remdesivir is brought to you by former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb. Scott's a board member for a company called Illumina. Illumina has been at the forefront of gene sequencing technology for companies like 23andMe. On June 10, 2020, less than a week before the FDA revoked emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine, the FDA approved Illumina's application for COVIDsec, a gene sequencing test for COVID-19. It not only tests you for COVID, it also obtains your entire genetic code. According to FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn, genetic sequencing information will help us monitor if and how the virus mutates, which will be crucial to our efforts to continue to learn and fight this virus. On June 17, 2020, Illumina acquired a company called Bluebee. Bluebee helps manage data, like your genetic code. Perhaps that's why Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos led a $100 million round of funding for Illumina's spin-off called Grail in 2016. Illumina repurchased Grail in 2021 and is now under investigation by the SEC for conduct and compensation of certain members of Illumina and Grail management. Should we be trusting our genetic blueprint to these people? According to Forbes, the biopharmaceutical industry provides 75% of the FDA's drug review budget. And now the story of a dog named Drew and his master, Pavlov. Every day, Pavlov would feed Drew. Drew's mouth would water every time he was fed. One day, Pavlov rang a bell just before feeding time. Pavlov rang the bell each day just before feeding. One day, the bell rang and Drew began to salivate. But there was no food. This involuntary reaction made Drew one of the most famous dogs in history. Together with his best friend Pavlov, Drew had proven the scientific theory of conditioning. It turns out that a wide variety of reactions can be triggered in similar fashion. Now imagine that Pavlov is a news network and viewers are all dogs. By repeatedly delivering negative information in association with trigger words or names, the head of a news organization could poison the minds of millions so that any mention of a person's name would instantly create negative, aggressive, or fear-based responses. Psychologists call this emotional transference. In a time of calamity, one could influence purchase habits. Remember the great toilet paper run of 2020? There was no real shortage of toilet paper, but the focus on toilet paper shortages by mass media resulted in hoarding, which created a real-world shortage. On a more interesting note, across the United States, there was a dramatic increase in the installation and use of bidets, a European alternative to toilet paper. The mass transition to bidets due to the perceived shortage of toilet paper is called behavior modification. Behavior modification was the basis of a decades-long series of CIA-funded human experiments in the United States and Canada, known as MKUltra. MKUltra used drugs like LSD and amphetamines on sometimes unwilling subjects. Combined with isolation, fear, and bombardment of repetitious messages, MK Ultra pushed the limits of human experimentation and mind control. Consider, the FDA and our medical institutions have released massive amounts of amphetamines and opioids on the American people over the last 40 years, while simultaneously a smaller and smaller number of politically charged elites dictate what shows we watch, what news we see, and what messages we are allowed to hear. Many of these people put profit and politics over civil rights and the Constitution. One has to wonder, did MK Ultra ever end? Or did it take over the world? With this kind of power, one could condition the world into believing a safe medication was deadly, or a deadly treatment was safe and effective, all by transferring the triggered hatred of a political figure. And it all started with a dog named Drew.
Our next presenter is Dr. Paul Marik. He has written over 500 peer-reviewed journal articles, 80 book chapters, and authored 4 critical care books, and has been cited over 48,000 times in peer-reviewed publications. And Dr. Marik is certainly one of those doctors who've been persecuted for treating patients.
The PALM study group investigated 4 drugs for the use of Ebola. The results were published December the 12th, 2019 in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that date is particularly important because that signaled the beginning of COVID. Remdesivir increased the risks of death and renal failure. It was such a toxic drug, the Data Safety Monitoring Board terminated the use of remdesivir. The NIH and the Act 1 study enrolled patients in a study looking at remdesivir for the treatment of COVID-19. The last patient was enrolled April 19, 2020. 10 days later, before the study had actually terminated, Dr. Fauci sat in the Oval Office of the White House and he said the trial was good news. What Dr. Fauci did not tell you was that the primary endpoint of the study was changed halfway during the study. We all know that is scientific misconduct. Because the study was not going to be positive, they changed the primary endpoint. They invented a bogus endpoint called time to recovery, which they showed in this study was statistically significant. And based on this bogus endpoint, remdesivir was approved by the FDA on October the 20th, 2020.
The data shows that remdesivir has a clear-cut, significant positive effect in diminishing the time to recovery. It was 11 days compared to 15 days. This will be the standard of care.
Standard of practice is set by a number of physicians who have a large amount of conflicts of interest. The people who lead these guideline committee, they're on the take. But the problem is that people die.
So we would have normally waited several days until the data gets further, dot the I and cross the T. But the data are not going to change. Some of the numbers may change a little, but the conclusion will not change.
If Big Pharma does a study that shows that its drug is no good, it has the option of not publishing it.
If this was a study conducted in China, it was terminated early, and it failed to show any benefit for remdesivir versus the standard of care.
Almost every single patient in this country is treated with the combination of remdesivir and low-dose dexamethasone. But just to make the situation even more preposterous, the federal government will give hospitals a 20% bonus on the entire hospital bill if they prescribe remdesivir to Medicare patients. The federal government is incentivizing hospitals to prescribe a medication which is toxic.
The hydroxychloroquine cocktail, it's about $20, right? Certainly no more than $50.
remdesivir, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of the side effects of that and the studies, the science behind that, costs over $3,000. Could that maybe be one of the reasons why all the effort is put on these more exotic therapeutics that cost thousands of dollars versus something that's off the shelf that costs $20?
We want to thank all the collaborators that have brought remdesivir to this point. And that certainly includes NIH and Dr. Fauci.
He authorized Gilead's application for emergency use authorization. This was lightning speed in terms of getting something approved, and from clinical trial to getting it authorized from the FDA, it's been quite the speedy but also effective process.
The FDA has a huge history of drugs going into widespread use in the medical community for decades that have not been established on the basis of randomized controlled trials.
I mean, the fact that it's an existing drug, that helps, but you still got to go through trials.
The FDA makes a decision which is sometimes totally independent of any finding by the advisory committee.
Dr. Rayford Brown chairs the FDA Opioid Advisory Committee. According to Dr. Brown, the FDA is putting the interests of Big Pharma ahead of public health. With approving the painkiller OxyContin, the FDA didn't even require Purdue Pharma to undergo clinical trials.
Opioid company Purdue gave a lot of money to the doctors to say that, hey, if you are in pain, you can't get addicted. It's like, that actually wasn't true at all, but that's what I was taught in medical school. If you're in pain, you can't be addicted.
And I'm quoting, the FDA has a lack of transparency and uses the advisory committees as cover.
The agencies turned a blind eye toward simple, cheap, possibly effective treatments that, by the way, created no harm.
According to the regulations, people who receive royalties are not required to divulge them even on their financial statement, according to the Bayh-Dole Act.
The hydroxychloroquine FDA Advisory Committee lists significant conflicts of interest. Some conflicts have not been properly disclosed.
Half of the chemotherapy drugs used in cancer were used without a randomized controlled trial. The antibiotics, amoxicillin, for example, that parents use with their children all the time, day in, day out, was never established with a randomized controlled trial before it was used.
China stopped the studies because they couldn't fully enroll them, because they stopped accruing cases in China because their epidemic had subsided.
This accidental admission that China has beaten the virus was brought to you by former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb. Scott's a board member of the company Pfizer. 4 months after this interview, Pfizer announced it was manufacturing Gilead's very expensive remdesivir. In 2019, Pfizer purchased a company called Mylan. Mylan used to make hydroxychloroquine in West Virginia, but after Pfizer got hold of it, they shut it down. In July of 2020, Mylan announced it would make the generic version of remdesivir for Gilead. None of these conflicts of interest were disclosed by CNBC.
I don't know why people weren't more positive all along about
remdesivir. It does not work. That is the bottom line. It is an ineffective drug. It is highly toxic, not just for the kidneys, but also for the liver, and it shouldn't be used. Okay, it's just a failed drug. It was an antiviral agent that never had a good indication. Fauci figured, let's get this into use for COVID. And it was his steamrolling that got it onto the standard now hospital protocol that is being reimbursed by government premiums. The hospital get extra money if they use remdesivir. This is horrific. This is truly centrally driven medical care, and it is so harmful. Doctors should not go along with it, but unfortunately, once you're in a hospital, you're an employee, and you either go along with it or you lose your job. Medical ethics out the window. We should never be doing anything harmful to patients. And here is a drug that is clearly harmful and has no benefit.
How much will you pay to live? Because the answer is everything.
The makers of the drug remdesivir have set a price for the medication.
It's $3,200, but what you didn't say yet is that Health and Human Services has bought up the whole supply.
No treatment until you go to the hospital. Then your treatment are two things that are bound to kill you: ventilators and remdesivir. And Tony Fauci knew the remdesivir would kill you. It is homicide. And if you look, how does it kill people? Kidney failure, heart failure, and all organ collapse.
They rolled out remdesivir onto a substantial number of patients for which we all saw it was killing the patients. And now it's the FDA-approved drug
that is continuing to kill patients in the United States. As these patients get remdesivir, they have a less than 25% chance of survival if they get more than 2 doses. Now, they're rolling it out on children as well, and into the nursing homes or skilled nursing facilities as early intervention. And if you ask me, this isn't a hospital, this is a concentration camp. Absolutely it is.
Because my mom was murdered on October 25th at Baylor Hospital. She was given remdesivir without our authority. We told them specifically not to give her remdesivir. 5 days later, all of my mom's organs shut down. We showed in the studies, over 30% of the people that were given remdesivir in the studies died. We told the doctor, the infectious disease specialist, do not give my mom remdesivir. Guess what they did? They gave her a 5-day cycle, and my mom is dead.
I'm so sorry, Mom. I love you so much.
Well, I just don't understand why I said I didn't want her remdesivir when you guys put her on remdesivir. I don't know.
The infectious disease doctors, and she had already been on that and completed.
Yeah, but I'm talking about before the first day we're in here, I said we didn't want to do that. And you guys did that anyway.
So if you look at the studies right now,
listen, I don't care about the studies. I asked you not to do something and you did it. Okay, that's the problem.
The Food and Drug Administration is under the direct control of Congress. It's often the captive of the industry that it is supposed to regulate, because the industry, the drug industry, has a powerful lobbying effect on Congress.
This is our fault. We don't have the fortitude to kick pharmaceutical lobbyists outside of our congressional offices.
So what's driving this blind obsession to disprove the effectiveness of a drug that is being used right now, tonight, in medical centers across America?
The studies I saw early on were designed to fail on hydroxychloroquine late in treatment, when people were basically ready to die, or when their heart was already affected by the virus. Of course, hydroxychloroquine does have an impact on arrhythmia at that late stage, but not early. Now that these other observational non-randomized studies have been conducted, 50% or 5-fold reduction in death and hospitalization versus the almost infinitesimal risk of hydroxychloroquine and zinc. This has made no sense to me whatsoever. The only explanation is the politicization of it.
Do you think that this is about making you a scapegoat to deflect from President Trump?
Of course. You have to be asleep not to figure that one out.
Well, there are a lot of Republican senators taking aim at this. I mean,
that's okay. I'm just going to do my job, and I'm going to be saving lives, and they're going to be lying.
It seems another layer of danger to play politics around matters of life and death.
Right, exactly. And to me, that's unbelievably bad, because all I want to do is save people's lives. I mean, anybody who's looking at this carefully realizes that there's a distinct anti-science flavor to this. So if they get up and criticize science, nobody's going to know what they're talking about. But if they get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci, well, people could recognize there's a person there, so it's easy to criticize. But they're really criticizing science, because I represent science. They're not doing it because they say they don't want to do it. They're Republicans. They don't like to be told what to do. And we got to break that, unpack that.
The risk of seeing 15% of that nursing home die was just not an acceptable risk. All the patients have done well.
I showed an 84% reduction in hospitalization and a 99.7% survival rate of my patients.
The Henry Ford Health System in Michigan tonight is announcing 13% of COVID patients given hydroxychloroquine died, while 26% of non-hydroxy patients succumbed to the disease.
I think this makes remdesivir relevant.
Despite this evidence, on August 13, 2020, the FDA denied Henry Ford Medical's emergency use authorization request for hydroxychloroquine. C19early.com maintains a database of all prophylactic studies of hydroxychloroquine. Despite the best efforts of the WHO and the National Institutes of Health, these studies demonstrate the benefit of pre-exposure prophylaxis, post-exposure prophylaxis, and early treatment with hydroxychloroquine.
Every study of the outpatient use of one particular drug, hydroxychloroquine, with or without accompanying agents, has shown substantial benefit in reducing risks of hospitalization and mortality.
0 cardiac complications.
The side effect is not the reason you should stop this drug at this moment. And they want people to believe there is no drugs for COVID-19.
On February 4th, 2020, Nature published a letter to the editor from scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This in vitro study showed the positive effects of chloroquine taken at any point during infection. The study also showed the lack of benefit from remdesivir. They concluded, since these compounds have been used in human patients with a safety track record and shown to be effective against various ailments, we suggest that they should be assessed in human patients suffering from the novel coronavirus disease, which explains why chloroquine is a recommended treatment in China. And our medical leaders had this information from the beginning. The potential reality of what has happened is a nightmare. How could so many doctors across the world be tricked and manipulated into something so horrible? Perhaps it's because our medical leaders don't think of you as human at all.
What do you foresee as being the next big thing to change this field?
Well, I'd say the next frontier, and this will show my bias as a software person, is to think of DNA as much more of a program than as a set of constants. We have become a major producer of large data sets that are going to be of incredible value for understanding how life works and how disease occurs. In the era where it is okay to basically sit on your own data set for many years, trying to mine it and then remine it, then remine it again, that era is over. And I'm certainly speaking as the NIH director here. We now have quite a lot of ways to encourage good behavior in this regard. Some of which are in fact less pleasant, some of which are in fact less pleasant, some of which are just that we've tried to provide appropriate incentives. I've often said that trying to manage the research community, many people have concluded is really like herding cats. And it is like herding cats, but guess what? I've got a big bag of cat food. It's called the NIH budget, and if it's appropriately applied, it can actually encourage some pretty good things to happen.
Instead of leading the charge to build factories to manufacture more of a drug we know is safe, our medical leaders wasted trillions to play with toys.
So once and for all, should people be taking hydroxychloroquine?
So just to be clear, we revoked an EUA, an emergency use authorization, at the request of another government agency, BARDA. And this was for drug that was authorized for use in sick hospitalized patients.
Hold up. Did the head of the FDA just throw somebody under the bus? Who's BARDA? BARDA is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. It was created in 2006 by Congressman Anna Eshoo. The director of BARDA is Gary Disbrow.
BARDA was established in 2006 to support the development of vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and innovative technologies that could be used when a public health emergency occurs.
BARDA also helps maintain the Strategic National Stockpile, a collection of drugs, vaccines, and other supplies needed in case of a biological attack or a pandemic. Any director of BARDA should have intimate knowledge of any drug that can help defend against weapons like anthrax or Coxiella burnetii, or every drug listed on the WHO's list of essential medications. In 2020, Gary reported to the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, Robert Kadlec, a former consultant to a company called Emergent Biosolutions. When Dr. Kadlec was nominated and confirmed in 2017, he failed to disclose his previous consulting and ties with Emergent Biosolutions and later awarded the company with a lucrative contract for a smallpox vaccine. But that story is not really a big deal. Experts hired in public office are expected to work with people that they know are professional. What is a big deal is that in the beginning of 2020, the head of BARDA was someone named Rick Bright.
And now we're at the point where we have to identify some of the most important people responsible for working in the background to make sure that you couldn't have access to hydroxychloroquine when you needed it the most. BARDA appears to be staffed primarily by PhDs, not medical doctors. These are people who do not treat patients.
So why did BARDA request a drug that was saving lives get removed from an emergency use authorization and do so in a way that terrorized doctors, hospitals, and pharmacies from prescribing it at any point in disease? To understand that, we need to go back in time to the beginning of the pandemic and the actions taken by the former director of BARDA, Rick Bright.
You know,
I wish I'd never heard of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, honestly.
As head of BARDA, Rick Bright was responsible for developing new therapies and working with pharmaceutical companies. When the Trump administration miraculously obtained tens of millions of doses of hydroxychloroquine, Rick, his team at BARDA, and members of the FDA sabotaged efforts to release hydroxychloroquine to the citizens of the United States during a time of national emergency. When Rick Bright's efforts to obstruct the release of hydroxychloroquine failed, he leaked emails to the press and was subsequently removed from his position at BARDA. Rick then claimed he was a whistleblower and testified before a congressional subcommittee headed by Congressman Anna Eshoo, whose district is mere blocks away from Gilead, a company that stood to make billions from remdesivir.
Madam Chair, on April 23rd, CNN reported that you planned to call Dr. Bright to testify. Dr. Bright did not actually file his whistleblower complaint with the Office of Special Counsel until Tuesday, May 5th. That same day, it was announced on social media that you planned to hold a hearing, but it was not officially noticed until 2 days later. To say this hearing is premature and it is a disservice to the investigations of Dr. Bright's complaint, I think goes without saying. You trampled on minority rights? You would have never tolerated that when you were in the minority.
Will the witness be under oath?
We don't swear people in.
I'm hearing from a lot of doctors, my state, around the country, who have experience using hydroxychloroquine, and they're reporting significant benefit if it is used early enough in the course and may eliminate the need for hospitalization and ventilatory support.
Gentleman's time.
I don't know if that's right. I think it's important enough that we should look into it, and would just be interested if you did that as part of your duties at BARDA.
The gentleman's time is expired.
So I believe it's important. I've heard those anecdotal stories as well, and they were not conducted in the context of a randomized controlled clinical study. It's very difficult to understand data from those types of observational studies or anecdotal stories. So the drug might have some benefit in some populations, but we won't know that until we have that information from a truly randomized controlled clinical study.
What happened to you? You were removed as a director of BARDA.
I believe part of the removal process for me was initiated because of a push back that I gave when they asked me to put in place an expanded access protocol that would make chloroquine more freely available to Americans that were not under the close supervision of a physician and may not even be confirmed to be infected with the coronavirus.
When was the potential use of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine as treatment for the COVID-19 first brought to your attention, sir?
I believe it's probably mid-March, between March 10th and March 17th, somewhere in that time frame.
And not prior to that?
Not that I recall. The first I heard of the drug itself was a call I received from Dr. Woodcock at the FDA asking if I'd heard of the drug. And I hadn't heard of the drug, and I hadn't heard of its potential use for COVID-19 patients. And I hadn't heard of the drug.
Did you hear that? He just admitted that he never heard of hydroxychloroquine. How is it that someone responsible for maintaining our response to a biological attack had never heard of this drug?
She said there might be something interesting to look at. And she forwarded a manuscript, a draft manuscript. And that's the first I learned of the drug itself.
You weren't aware of any news articles and research papers in January discussing the potential benefits of the drug?
I had heard anecdotal stories and reports, sir.
You had?
I had probably, I can't recall if I did specifically for chloroquine, but I tried to track the media and the scientific journal as well. However, I rely on the guidance of the science within HHS. And the first I had heard of that was from my colleague, Dr. Woodcock at the FDA. And then a summary report from our scientists at FDA, CDC, NIH, and BARDA that indicated that the evidence for its benefit was weak and the evidence for its safety concerns was stronger. And they did not believe at that point it was something that should be supported.
What was your reaction personally? Did you think it was something worth pursuing initially when you heard it from Dr. Woodcock?
Initially, I said I do believe it. I mean, I trust Dr. Woodcock and her scientific judgment immensely. We have heard of anecdotal data from different physicians that they believe they've seen benefit or patient improvement from use of this drug in either combination with an antibiotic, azithromycin, or a combination with zinc or other vitamin C or other things. But there was never sufficient evidence from a randomized controlled study to show its benefit would actually outweigh the potential risk.
There's been a lot of hype about cures for COVID that have been shown to be ineffective and even dangerous. We are now seeing the very real dangers and consequences of not making decisions based on science. Hydroxychloroquine, which Fox News commentators and then the White House repeatedly touted and actually encouraged people to use, is Exhibit A on this list.
Meet Congressman Dr. Raul Ruiz. Dr. Ruiz is a medical doctor, and he knows exactly how safe tonic water is, yet he was happy to participate in the slander of a drug that could have saved his constituents' lives, if it meant hurting Donald Trump, in an election year. And to make matters worse, Raul participated in the promotion of remdesivir. According to Open Secrets, his major donors are in the healthcare industry.
But there is one drug that appears to provide some therapeutic benefit, remdesivir. 2 weeks ago, Dr. Fauci announced that remdesivir showed a clear-cut, significant positive effect in diminishing the time to recovery.
More broadly.
So was it because the president was encouraged by the use of this drug that you became discouraged by it?
And nothing to do with politics, sir. I wanted to make sure that Americans were aware of the risk of this drug. It was only available under very...
But it is a drug that is indicated and has been used safely in the past.
By almost 1.5 minutes. You can finish your answer, Dr. Bright, and then we're going to move to the next member.
The drug had been used safely for malaria for a number of years. We didn't have a database of...
But it's being used in the same dosage as it was used for malaria.
Please. And I know that I'm overly generous with both sides of the aisle.
Speaking of generosity, as of 2020, Congressman Anna Eshoo was the #1 recipient of pharmaceutical money while chairing the House Health Subcommittee.
But I think that we need to move on. I mean, 2 minutes of extra time is 2 minutes of extra time.
People died because you weren't listened to.
People died because they didn't have appropriate protective equipment.
And your statement that we need to be told the truth is probably the most important statement we've heard all day.
I think that you are the finest ambassador in our country for scientists. Frankly, I'm tired of those who bear the responsibility, accepting none of it, while deflecting blame on others. The previous administration, the World Health Organization, the Wuhan lab, anywhere but where the blame belongs. And we all have been witnessed your integrity.
Let me just say, Dr. Bright, thank you for your courage.
President has sidelined our best scientists, pushed baseless conspiracy theories, and more recently prescribed unproven remedies like Lysol to suffering Americans.
Because the president was encouraged by the use of this drug that you became discouraged by it?
And nothing to do with politics, sir. And nothing to do with politics, sir.
On October 13th, 2020, 2 weeks before the election, Rick Bright appeared in a documentary titled Totally Under Control.
There was not a scientific reason to push either one of those drugs.
No scientific reason aside from 400 years of human history.
The reason they were pushing them so hard was because the president was claiming that they were a miracle drug. Someone had given him this advice, nothing to do with politics, sir. I lost it. I lost all respect for that chain of command, for that security, and nothing to do with politics, sir. It's not easy to come forward in this administration, okay? I'm not trying to be soften here, but it is not easy. It was a very hard process to lay our careers on the line to push back.
Keep in mind, he's basically crying about tonic water.
And nothing to do with politics, sir.
Whether it's right or not, data will show. But, you know, if 2 years from now we have the studies and we say, hey, that stuff really would have worked, and the government stopped that from being used, if I was a family of a person that was stopped from getting hydroxychloroquine, I'd be pretty mad.
So who came up with the idea to deny hydroxychloroquine for early treatment? According to Rick Bright's sworn whistleblower statement, on March 24th, 2020, Dr. Janet Woodcock called Dr. Bright and strongly recommended that BARDA submit an application for an EUA instead of an expanded access IND protocol. The idea to deny early treatment came from the FDA. Rick Bright's complaint continues. Over the next several days, Dr. Bright and Dr. Woodcock urged their colleagues on the clinical and regulatory teams implementing the Secretary's directive to secure an EUA for chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine instead of a national expanded access IND protocol. Implementing the EUA was a compromised position to rein in HHS leadership's initial campaign to make the drug available to the public outside of a hospital setting and without physician supervision. A tactic that guaranteed the drug would not be used early when it was needed.
Peter Navarro had to go down and have a huge fight in the Situation Room just to get the tablets. And I don't know how he did it, but within a week or so, we had 62 million doses. This was the answer. This would have halted the pandemic. It would have brought it under control. 52 other countries have used it successfully to keep their pandemic, their hospital admissions under control. We wouldn't have surged out into the number of cases we had and the deaths.
At the time, Janet Woodcock was the head of the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, also known as CDER. In her role, as with Rick Bright, their jobs were primarily to streamline and facilitate the development of new drugs and new vaccines. They worked heavily with pharmaceutical companies and were probably the last people who should have been involved in getting approval for early use for one of the safest, cheapest, and most beneficial medications in human history.
There was a single point failure in this entire pandemic plan which would have worked. Orders came down through Secretary Azar at Health and Human Services to Bob Kadlec at Pandemic Planning to Janet Woodcock and to Rick Bright. This needed an investigational new drug authority. All that is a simple statement saying doctors can prescribe this for something that it wasn't originally designed for. It's done all the time. It's called off-label prescriptions. It's a doctor's right to be able to do that, as long as it's an FDA-approved drug.
Okay.
And hydroxychloroquine has been FDA approved for years.
Decades.
Janet Woodcock phoned Rick Bright that same evening. And this is from Rick Bright's own legal deposition. Phoned Rick Bright that same evening, head of BARDA, and said, "Oh, this is a very dangerous drug."
Why did she say that?
I don't know, because she's a rheumatologist. She would have known how safe the drug was. She would have prescribed it herself.
We submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for communications between Rick Bright and Janet Woodcock and received a call from the FDA.
A request for communications is considered a complex track request, and these requests are processed in date order priority, and there are currently 1,100 in queue. So you'd be looking at least 24 months before this comes up for processing.
And incidentally, in terms of safety, Dr. Woodcock was also directly involved in the approval of all of the opioids, including OxyContin and fentanyl, over the last 25 years. A class of drugs taken at home by average Americans and responsible for millions of deaths. Additionally, Janet Woodcock was also on the editorial board of the New England Journal of Medicine when it published the fraudulent Surgisphere study.
To make her head of the FDA, it's not just putting the fox in the hen coop. It's putting the devil in. I can't imagine a worse appointment than Janet Woodcock.
When researching quinine through the Federal Register, we discovered that Janet Woodcock and the FDA have been actively working to restrict the United States citizens from access to quinine for at least 27 years. Claiming in 1995, the agency tentatively concludes that quinine is not safe for over-the-counter use and the treatment of malaria. Remember, cinchona and quinine were crucial to nearly every military conflict in the history of American warfare. On August 2, 1946, cinchona alkaloids were considered requirements for the defense of the United States. If leaders of the FDA and BARDA had been alive during World War II, the United States would have very likely lost the war.
Each accused became a cogwheel in a monstrous slaughter machine.
We should have recognized that when treatment was being suppressed, and by the way, not hypothetical treatment, published treatment, when that was being suppressed, we should have gone, hold on a minute, sounds like there's a racket here. Somebody's suppressing real treatment options, and they're suppressing it so that they can justify an emergency medical countermeasure that can only be authorized if there are no treatment options. The CDC used to be before it became the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the U.S. Malaria Suppression Program in Atlanta, Georgia, which did what? Advocate for the distribution of hydroxychloroquine. This is one of those things where you sit back and you go, the audacity of the crime is what's surprising, and how blind the public is to reading the information that is right in front of their face.
The conspiracy between Janet Woodcock and Rick Bright to make it so that physicians could not administer hydroxychloroquine outside of the hospital.
Between the two of them, there was some sort of a concerted effort to suppress the use of hydroxychloroquine.
Rick Bright, in videotaped testimony, has explicitly spoken about how they conspired to cook a strategy using emergency use authorization to make it so that hydroxychloroquine could only be administered in the hospital, which, by the way, is too late for when hydroxy should be used.
And why did they do that?
That is what is the unknown, and there's so many whys and hows behind this. I like to say there's a stack of stuff that doesn't make sense that's about this high.
When I heard from Dr. Woodcock that it's something that we should try to investigate in a randomized controlled study, I even reached out to a company that was licensed and approved to make that drug in the United States to see if they could donate that drug to the NIH to conduct those clinical studies. It was only after I learned that supply that was being discussed was coming in from Pakistan and from India, from facilities that were not approved by the FDA, and the drug was not approved for use in the United States, that I became increasingly alarmed of having that drug in the United States.
There are risks in using drugs manufactured from facilities not inspected by the FDA. In a 2021 correspondence with Dr. Woodcock, in a question about the quality of the donated hydroxychloroquine, she told us, "We tested the HCQ ourselves very intensively, which means there was no problem with the hydroxychloroquine from India and Pakistan. But more importantly, why were we forced to beg for a drug that should have been in our strategic national stockpile?"
Not having hydroxychloroquine in our strategic national stockpile was a major error. Chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine have shown benefit for multiple bacterial weapons, like Coxiella burnetii, as well as anthrax.
Coxiella burnetii is very interesting in that it has many of the same symptoms of what we were told was COVID early on in the pandemic. When asked about Coxiella, a known biological weapon, and why we weren't testing for it in the United States, Dr. Woodcock simply stated, "I'm not answering the questions about Coxiella." The term gaslighting comes from the movie The Gaslight, a 1944 film which depicts a woman whose husband lies to her by claiming something is not happening when it actually is.
And you thought I was being cruel to you, keeping people away from making you a prisoner.
Oh, you're the kindest man in the world.
Gaslighting is defined as manipulating someone using psychological methods into questioning their own sanity or powers of reasoning. Gaslighting is an insidious way of making a person doubt themselves. Gaslighters often claim your memory of events is incorrect. They may withhold information, pretend to be confused by what you're saying, or simply refuse to listen to you at all. They may trivialize your concerns or feelings, making you feel unimportant or irrational. Which leads us to a special category of manipulation known as medical gaslighting. Medical gaslighting occurs when doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers dismiss symptoms from patients, especially female patients. Gaslit patients may have difficulty getting additional tests, are mocked for doing their own research, discouraged from obtaining a second opinion, obstructed from their own medical records, and ultimately feel talked down to by their doctors. Take the case of 8-year-old Riley Jones, a vaccine-injured girl who we interviewed in 2022.
At VCU, we had a nurse laugh at us. We had a doctor laugh at us. We had a nurse tell us that we were crazy. A nurse laughed at my mom. Why are you treating human beings like this?
How does it make you feel when the doctors and nurses laugh and you know your mom and dad are worried?
It makes me mad, upset, sad. But only thing I know is that it makes me very upset that nobody will believe me and just treat it.
Gaslighting is typically employed by narcissists and those with similar personality disorders. What does it say about the practice of medicine that there's an entire category of gaslighting just for doctors and nurses.
A whistleblower, Dr. Rick Bright, who was asked by his superiors to work on establishing an FDA expanded access investigational new drug protocol. But his insubordination, he instead went to Janet Woodcock and people in the FDA and got the emergency use authorization, which sounds like, hey, we're going to expand the use of this. No, he dramatically restricted the use of hydroxychloroquine only in hospital, but I think we all recognize it's probably not particularly effective, possibly dangerous, and only out of the national stockpile. He knew what he was doing. That's what poisoned the well. That's what created what I've called the prescription logjam here on hydroxychloroquine. I think it affected all early treatment options. It took them off the table. We took our eye off the ball. That's why I say our agencies failed us. These individuals in these agencies failed us.
BARDA works closely with Anthony Fauci. Anthony Fauci was funding gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China. Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins worked desperately in the early phases of COVID and later on to make certain that the public did not know these details.
Kadlec says Fauci was worried about protecting his own reputation, and that could be why he diverted attention away from the lab leak.
That would be a natural reaction of him or anybody, particularly, I think for him, to saying, what could this do to me and to our institute as a consequence if we were found to have some culpability or some involvement in this? And I think what probably made that even more acute was the fact that they didn't have good visibility into what they were doing and what they were supporting through the grants, through EcoHealth Alliance that went to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I think that just probably magnified that concern.
This is what Anthony Fauci's manipulation of the media and diverting attention looks like.
If it may have been a lab, may have been nature, we're supposed to look forward, then why did Dr. Fauci work so hard for just one of those theories?
What do you say to that? I'm almost have to laugh at that, Neil. I mean, that's totally bizarre. First of all, I wasn't leaning totally strongly one way or the other.
Flashback.
What I do feel strongly about is that this was a spillover from an animal species to a human, strongly suggesting that in fact it was a natural occurrence, strongly indicating that it was a natural spillover, strongly points to this being a natural occurrence, pointing much more strongly, pretty strong, towards a natural occurrence, very, very strongly favors a natural occurrence. I wasn't leaning totally strongly one way or the other. It's very, very strongly leaning towards this could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated.
Sir Richard Dearlove is the former head of the British spy agency MI6. He says stifling of the debate around the origins of COVID was led by Anthony Fauci.
We've now, through FOI, Freedom of Information, got a pretty clear idea of what meetings took place, what happened. They put forward one side of the argument, which they, for reasons I don't fully understand, decided to support and made absolutely sure that the opposite view was not given any oxygen or media publicity.
In the years leading up to 2020, the Trump administration was actively investigating Chinese and other foreign influence at the NIH, as well as academic institutions like Harvard. And by 2020, the noose was tightening around the NIH.
The U.S. is charging a top Harvard scientist along with 2 Chinese researchers over hiding China ties and payments.
The National Institutes of Health have 180 at least open cases on fraud, grant fraud. Also, the FBI, they say, working on 1,000 cases related to China and grant fraud, possibly with China targeting these researchers.
COVID was a threat to Donald Trump's re-election. If the pandemic continued to be deadly into the fall of 2020, whether from viral infections, remdesivir injury, or denial of proper hospital care, then emergency mail-in ballot protocols, like the ones conveniently created in the state of Georgia in 2019, would be justified. A Biden administration might be less eager to investigate COVID origins, which is exactly what happened.
There were scientists in the US intelligence agencies who were highly skeptical of the flimsy proximal origins paper that Fauci was promoting. analysts at the National Center for Medical Intelligence came to the opposite conclusion. They believed the virus was more likely than not created in a lab. But they were censored and silenced. Confidential sources tell me their input was removed from US President Joe Biden's COVID origins probe.
Could this be Anthony Fauci's motive to discredit any quick fix for COVID in early 2020?
And you are implying that what we did was responsible for the deaths of individuals. I totally resent that. And if anybody is lying here, Senator, it is you.
On October 29th, 2019, Anthony Fauci and Rick Bright appeared together on a universal flu vaccine panel discussing ways to improve our vaccine technology.
Why don't we blow the system up? I mean, obviously we can't just turn off the spigot on the system we have and then say, hey, everyone in the world should get this new vaccine we haven't given to anyone yet. But there must be some way.
To make it sexy, I think we have to, I like the concept, disrupting this field. I think in parallel, there might be a need or even an urgent call for an entity of excitement out there that's completely disruptive, that's not beholden to bureaucratic strings and processes.
Well, as Rick said, we're responsible for a variety of diseases, making countermeasures: malaria, tuberculosis, Zika, Ebola. We're in the middle of Ebola right now.
Did you hear that? Malaria. BARDA is designed to help protect us from malaria. So how did Rick Bright not know about hydroxychloroquine?
And that's where the federal government comes in. Well, yeah, seriously.
Is this next question the seed that was planted that caused all of the drama around COVID?
If the 2009 pandemic had been much more deadly, would that have ended up being a better thing for humanity?
Would it have been? No. Because we had not as certainly as serious as the 1918, but we had a pretty bad pandemic in 1957 and 1968. That didn't change much.
I mean, the sad truth is that when there's a major crisis, it focuses attention and usually resources and some significant mobilization follows. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are using resources in the best way possible, though, because it's done in the moment of crisis, and there's throwing money at things that sound good without them being thought through. And then there's what we used to call the U-shaped curve of concern, where there's the initial increase in interest in resources, and then when the problem fades and other problems emerge instead, then everything drops off. And I think we've been in that with many different outbreaks of disease and flu to some degree as well.
Rick Bright's leaked emails show that very early into COVID, he and BARDA wanted more money before they would assist the government's response. The agency got what it wanted. Congress rewarded them with billions in funds, billions of dollars that BARDA then awarded to pharmaceutical companies like AstraZeneca. It seems the people involved in our government response had financial, personal, professional, and sadly, political reasons to ensure that hydroxychloroquine was not allowed as a treatment for COVID. With $11 trillion on the line and the risk of Donald Trump being reelected if he were allowed to be right, could you have stood up and said hydroxychloroquine works?
All these doctors who are trying to, point out the problem get shut down.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stupidest news cycle we've ever faced.
There are numerous studies on this which show preliminary therapeutics.
What are your qualifications to weigh in on medicine more than Dr. Anthony Fauci?
Everything in the news is BS. Everything. There is nothing that I can consume on any legacy media that I can trust. That is shocking.
Right-wing media?
Does the news industry need advertisers to exist?
They do. As a viewer, you've got to look at who is advertising on this TV station, and you've got to realize that surely this TV station doesn't want to hurt its advertisers.
It is brought to you by Pfizer. CBS Health Watch, sponsored by
Pfizer.
What can doctors do?
Hydroxychloroquine cuts the risk of hospitalization in half.
The leaders of our medical institutions have betrayed us all.
But have to respectfully, totally disagree with him.
Has Dr. Fauci ever called you and asked you your opinion and why you have the opinion that you do?
No.
Dark money is everywhere.
The $250 million that the Gates Foundation has put into news and journalism. It's hard to really overestimate these kind of financial conflicts of interest. The real issue at hand is the political influence that they're gaining over public policy through their charity. We read the headline about all the good that they're doing, but no journalists really take a step back and look backwards at what they've actually done.
The committee is investigating an allegation that the House of Representatives had received $10 million to pass the controversial infectious diseases bill.
We will leave no stone unturned. The foundation has not offered any financial incentives to any member of the Nigerian legislative branch.
The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has poured billions of dollars across the world. We've mapped their donations. Their influence can be seen everywhere.
Stop the media, okay? That's the number one. Because media interference is huge.
Pharma buys off the news, and the FDA can issue an order tomorrow saying that we can't have pharma spending on TV news.
A lot of what they have learned in medical school is junk science, sadly. So we have to get back to real science, get rid of the pharma-based approach to medicine, and go back to more of a natural approach to medicine and an ethical approach.
Speaking of ethics, Anthony Fauci's wife heads the NIH ethics department.
Doctors being targeted now and being threatened.
I know many doctors who've been targeted and threatened and sanctioned risk losing their job. Absolutely, they're brought up by the state medical board.
Whenever you're relying on the fact that you think you're going to be getting truth about a subject and you realize it's all on you to protect your patients and that you can't trust anything that's coming at you from the government or pharmaceutical companies, medical societies, that is so stressful. It has been a stressful last 3 years because of the fact that the burden of truth now lies on us individuals or physicians who are willing to look for that truth.
The United States spent over $11 trillion on COVID and COVID response. Much of that money went to academics and pharmaceutical companies. What actions could an already corrupt industry justify for an $11 trillion windfall?
So why did this happen? And I talked to our kids about this. We've let it. Sorry. Our generation let this happen. We let the government overreach and overreach and overreach and overreach. And now we are so far into it that we don't know what to do. We're not organized.
What has really upset me in a way is the realization that medicine has become a corporate entity.
And a lot of the doctors that are saying that, oh, this doesn't work, they all have like exotic specialties like, plastic surgery and, dermatology. They don't see patients. They don't see COVID patients. They've never seen any, so of course they are scared. They hear the narrative of, oh, this medication will kill you, and then they're scared. But hydroxychloroquine is like one of the most, I would say it's one of the most safest medications.
My problem here is not so much that we have a differing reading of the literature, which we clearly do. It is this idea that there is this broad conspiracy across, hundreds of thousands of doctors, the NIH, the CDC, all academic institutions, the Infectious Disease Society of America. We're all in on this conspiracy to prevent Americans from getting a life-saving therapy. As you might imagine, pulling off a conspiracy like that would be extremely difficult. Doctors and academics are way too disorganized to pull off such a thing.
I never use the word conspiracy. Okay? I don't think anybody on this. So quit using that word.
Okay.
Okay. There's something has happened where we have not devoted any time or energy or resources to doing what could have stopped this COVID crisis very quickly, and that's called early intervention, early treatment. As a human being, as an American citizen, with the freedom, with a bill that I helped pass now, Right to Try, should have the right to access this without the interference of bureaucrats in the CDC, NIH, and the FDA. And that is exactly what's happened. I can't get it. Millions of Americans can't access it because of the disinformation, the scaremongering, and the prescription logjam that has been created by bureaucrats.
So could it be that I am wrong and Dr. Risch is right? Well, sure, people can disagree. But when you look at the broad consensus in the American scientific community, basically the scientific consensus is very clear that hydroxychloroquine is not effective.
We were at war in this pandemic, and my colleague Dr. Brian Tyson and I took an aggressive approach, and it implied using the art of medicine, or the principles that we'd learned. And I learned those principles 50 years ago, and I was lucky to have gone to Harvard. I wonder if Dr. Jha actually treats patients, actually the way he talks.
When there is no science or evidence on something, and if I'm going to think about an off-label use, I'm very careful about that, because the history of medicine is one of often doing more harm than good. And my first oath as a practicing physician was to do no harm. And so I am very much driven by that. And I started off saying that all three of these gentlemen strike me as both smart and committed and caring. I would appreciate a similar sort of respect back. I do take care of patients, and I try to do my best by them. Obviously, I'm not perfect, but I try to use science as well as compassion to guide me.
We appreciate that. Have you treated any COVID patients?
I have not, sir.
Okay.
I have not, sir.
Unfortunately, the Democrat witness, Dr. Ashish Jha, began tweeting his negative viewpoint of early treatment before the hearing even began, and continues his media blitz for days afterward. Most obnoxiously, and it was obnoxious, he penned an op-ed that the New York Times ran and headlined, quote, "The snake oil salesman of the Senate," unquote. The absurdity of calling Dr. Jha as a witness or paying any attention to him in the media was demonstrated when I asked him during the hearing, "Have you treated any COVID patients?" His reply, "I have not, sir."
The news censors and defames healthcare workers who speak out.
How many of you personally have witnessed censorship, intimidation, or professional reprisal and damage as a result of your advocacy for patients?
Many doctors are actually working in employed positions, and as time went on, they were told in no uncertain terms, if you use these drugs, you probably will be fired.
The politicians attack them.
This crazy woman he talked about last night about, who's an absolute disgrace.
How does the system stop the one that works as a therapy and pushes the one that doesn't work, which is the gene therapy? I think that's where people are having a hard time.
Through use of the mass media.
And you had Jimmy Kimmel saying the president's trying to kill himself by taking it. Joe Scarborough saying this will kill you. Neil Cavuto saying, what have you got to lose? One thing you have to lose are lives. And you had Chris Cuomo saying the president knows that hydroxychloroquine is not supported by science. Turns out that Chris Cuomo took a less safe version of it.
Didier Raoult is a microbiologist with a long and respected career. His critics were very quick to point to possible dangerous side effects.
Dr. Raoult, a renowned virologist, published the data for over 4,000 patients. They vilified him. They think you're dangerous. Of course they think I'm dangerous because I'm speaking truth.
Their faith is ridiculed.
Is Dr. Stella Emanuel, who, when she's not preaching about witches and astral sex and demon sperm and alien DNA, is part of a group of Tea Party-sponsored doctors advocating for unproven and, according to a number of legitimate medical studies, potentially dangerous COVID treatment.
You saw how the president responded. I mean, he clearly wasn't aware of this woman's statements before, but then even after we had told him what she had said, he stood by her.
In case you were wondering, this is not the first medical doctor whose religious beliefs CNN has featured.
Do you want to cleanse your sins in the river?
How did I come into this whole equation?
Sorry, Sanjay, just had to prove a point.
These kind of racist remarks actually would not help.
Finally right about something.
I think physicians in general have become so dependent on corporate employment that they're not willing to rock the boat in any way.
Continue to prescribe it, but I do so extremely carefully because I know
The administration's looking over my shoulder. I know it.
The drug is working, and it's working better when you give it earlier in the course of the disease.
I have lost trust in humanity, in my government, in my agencies. Trust is very hard to get back.
In Queensland, Australia, a doctor will be put in jail for prescribing hydroxychloroquine. And if you go over to India, they're going to give it to you right away. They give it first line in their guidelines. The Greek guidelines give hydroxychloroquine, but in Queensland, you get put in jail. In the United States, we're caught up in this flurry of data and confusion. Something is going very wrong in this world.
History is unforgiving. It will become very clear very soon who was on the right side of history, who was on the wrong side of history.
I was contacted by a doctor who I think had written 4 prescriptions for hydroxychloroquine, 4. And she was issued a grand jury subpoena by the Homeland Security Investigation Department. Something's not right about that. There's something that has gone wrong here.
We have a drug that is very safe. We're fighting for our patients.
You know, I'm a pharmacist in New Jersey. In terms of a prophylaxis, I think hydroxychloroquine should be used widespread.
I had to catch myself for a second and say, wait a minute, I'm breathing. I thought I was at the end of my rope.
Politics needs to be put aside at a time like this. We're in a pandemic.
In Ohio, the state pharmacy board has reversed its decision to prohibit hydrochloroquine use for COVID-19 patients.
Should the U.S. ban hydroxychloroquine as a treatment for COVID?
In the years since the events of 2020, there has been a concerted effort across all media, medicine, and academia to whitewash what was done to our people. How many needlessly suffered and died alone in hospitals because of lack of early treatment. I hope you've learned how to recognize some of the tricks propagandists have been using against you in this psychological war that is still very active in 2024. For example, this French study released on January 2nd, 2024, claims hydroxychloroquine killed nearly 17,000 patients. The problem? The study only looked at hospitalized patients. This is just another study that refuses to look at early use, the mechanism of action for cinchona alkaloids for over 400 years. After nearly 8 months of being cited by critics to attack prescribers of hydroxychloroquine, the study was retracted. Speaking of France, in France, hydroxychloroquine used to be sold over the counter. But in October of 2019, the French version of the FDA for some reason reclassified hydroxychloroquine as prescription only. Perhaps someone should do a study into the unusual actions of other governments prior to 2020. In November of 2023, I sent a final email to Janet Woodcock. I wanted to give her a chance to explain what I saw. The email in part states, Dr. Woodcock, reports indicate you were instrumental in ensuring that a drug that has played such a vital role in human history was not used to prevent COVID-19. Right now, it appears that members of the federal government played politics with science to remove a sitting president and pull off an $11 trillion heist. The consequences of those actions, based on reports provided to me by doctors and nurses around the nation, are scores of vaccine killed and injured that I have encountered in my last 2 years of reporting, all of whom have been denied compensation for their suffering and loss. Untold suffering for patients and families who were killed in hospitals with improper care. Trillions of dollars bled out from taxpayers. Erosion of liberties across the nation. A massive wave of public distrust of science, medicine, the federal government, and research institutions. The National Institutes of Health and National Cancer Institute have been caught suppressing links between the COVID-19 vaccine spike protein and suppressed P53-induced cancers. I contacted you 2 years ago and discussed SV40 in the polio vaccine. Now, SV40 components have been discovered in the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine. I also asked you about Coxiella testing in the United States, and you refused to answer. Vaccine injuries are significant and everywhere. Oncologists are telling me of massive spikes in new cancers. Healthcare workers are seeking me out to describe how they unnecessarily intubated patients diagnosed with COVID. Pharmacists are so ignorant that they refuse basic prescriptions because they saw an FDA tweet. ER workers are seeing teenagers present with strokes and children dying of heart attacks. Clearly, the FDA's warning systems have failed. Dr. Woodcock's reply, I have no comment. 8 days after this email, Dr. Woodcock announced her retirement from the FDA. I hope we've shown you how key people in our government and media had the means, motive, and opportunity to pull off this epic heist. This may be the most profound scandal in human history. If you have information that can help bring down this cartel of organized medical crime, come forward. We are making progress. Political groups that refuse pharma lobbyist cash are forming to support principled candidates across the nation. Journalists and podcasters are speaking truth to power and holding this beast of government accountable. Citizens around the world are awakening. And for all of you who have been fighting, this gin and tonic's for you. Cheers.
I want you to know I've gone to coronapreventionnetwork.org and I've signed up for the trial. But if I don't get in, I want to know, hey, can I get the vaccine in?
If I were you, I'm not sure I would volunteer without a trial to learn from the circumstance, because you might be sort of getting yourself injected with something that ultimately turns out not to be very helpful.
The public thinks that doctors are all crooked. Unfortunately, they're probably right.
For bibliography and more, visit epidemicoffraud.com.
The reason we paid doctors was to help people. But we're not.
Imagine there's no traffic. Everyone's at home. No schools, no meetings. Just Zooming or the phone. Imagine all the people wearing the masks outside. Imagine all the nurses, aides and doctors too, working day and night now, all gowned up in the ICU. Imagine mitigation, flattening the curve. You may say it's just a virus, but it's not the common cold. And each one of us can spread it and put at risk the world. Imagine empty cafes. I wonder if you can. Yeah, I bet you can. Rediscovering your kitchen. And 6 feet from your fellow man and woman. Imagine all the people keeping your neighbors safe. You may say it's overreacting and you want to break the quarantine. Don't do it. All the people have to join us to stop COVID-19. Imagine all the science, that's what we do. Treatments that give us hope. Lots of tests to help us before the world goes broke. Imagine there's a vaccine and it's ready for us all. You may feel like it's forever and you've had to stay inside. But we're all in this together. NIH is saving lives. But we're all in this together. NIH is saving lives. You're saving. And imagine we're going to get through this, because we will.